Well, I personally have never been so superfluous as a moderator as to moderate such a self-moderated group. Everybody finished on time and, of course, had very interesting, provocative things to say. We're at 2:35, but I assume there's time for a few questions. And I see one over there. That was the first hand that I saw.
Hello, to a student. Actually, I have a couple comments versus questions. Oh yes, this is Constance Lehman, CEO of Consumer Directed Choices, Albany, New York. In New York State, we have a consumer directed program. One comment is that we found that agencies cannot provide the amount of hours that are necessary. So there has been a lot of comment about the explosion of consumer direction in New York State, when actually, when you look at the amount of authorized hours, they haven't changed. They're just being served. And so that's a one big thing to keep in mind when you're looking at, cost effectiveness, because again, the needs were already there, they were just not being met.
That is something that cash and counseling demonstrated.
Oh, good.
I'm sorry. Also in the Netherlands, where there's been a big increase in consumer-directed care, that's largely a reaction to frustration with the agency-directed care, where they just can't seem to hire the workers and therefore provide the care. So people are basically taking the cash and doing the best they can.
The second piece about cost effectiveness is that in New York State there is an amendment to the Nurse Practice Act, and I think it is important to note that consumer direction isn't just the ability to hire whoever you'd like. It really is a step back from the medical model, where you really take complete control of not only your staffing but your body. And that's very important, because the nursing rate years ago when I had the agency was $90 a pop. And now, since I train my own worker for about $17 an hour, that's a huge, huge savings. And believe me, as a person who's not under a research study, I would never go back, ever, 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 to an agency model. And the next thing is, when it does come to all this research and such, I think that, years and years ago, this isn't really a reinvention of a wheel. In 1979, the Veterans Administration was doing this type of thing. My stepfather was a logger, broke his neck. They took my mother down to the VA hospital, and they trained her how to do everything. He was a C3 quad. We lived in the middle of the woods in between Cooperstown and Cherry Valley, and she did everything for him. So when I was growing up, I saw consumer directed at its best, and of course, they paid her to care for him too. So, he was home and alive for 14 years without being institutionalized. So I think we just have to step back and say, this isn't anything new, and, it's more natural in the way that everything should move.
Thank you. Pam?
Yes, I wanted to follow up on some of the same points that were just made, particularly about the issue about the cost increases associated with actually getting access to your authorized hours, which I felt sort of wasn't particularly reflected in Peter's presentation on that, that's what we really saw in cash and counseling, and particularly in some states more than others, and particularly in Arkansas, where the population is very rural, and there is really a dearth of providers. And what we really saw is that the agency providers in some states really do not have the capacity to meet the demand now. And so the idea that you're taking work away from agency providers, they really can't do, and then what they're being expected to do now, and with the population aging and greater demand, it's hard to see how they're going to keep up with that. And in cash and counseling, it was, and in the programs now that they're out of the demo phase, it's a voluntary thing to go into consumer direction. And some people go into it philosophically because they want to be in control, but a lot of people go in because they are the ones that are not being served in the current system. And I think what we need to keep in mind is that, you know, when we're dealing with statistics, of course, we're dealing with medians and means and so forth. But in the real world, I think what we saw in Arkansas was that there's a group of people that are seriously disadvantaged in the traditional system, in that they happen to live in an area where the providers cannot serve them and so forth. Or they have had very bad experiences with the quality of agency care, with people coming out and saying, you know, I'm not going to do the tasks that you need, or not being very productive. And so, you know, we did see, for example, that of those being served, we were sort of shocked in the control group in Arkansas that they were only getting 66% of their care plan authorized hours. And in Arkansas, the authorized level, because it's a very poor state, is not very munificent to begin with. Now, the other point I'll make about cost, too, is, I mean, Peter did mention we got nursing home offsets. We got some offsets from the other Medicaid expenditures. Over 3 years, they pretty much did offset the higher costs. But then the other thing that we need to look at, which is another finding and one problem with the hugeness of the cash and counseling demonstration and the voluminous reports, is a lot of the findings are kind of, you know, haven't been highlighted. And one thing we did look at was the combined Medicare and Medicaid costs. And except for the MRDD population, the majority of these folks are duals. Now, we did not get statistically significant reductions in Medicare expenditures, but the general trend was downward. And one of the interesting things is because Medicare expenditures are so big, small reductions that are non-significant in the Medicare context, because it's so huge, can add up and actually offset small, albeit significantly significant differences in personal assistance services spending. And one thing, you know, we are all here because we think personal assistance services are very important, but in the larger scheme of things, from a financial point of view, they're like a small part of what we're spending on medical care. And so I would say that in that larger perspective, even though we can't say we saw statistically significant reductions, the reality of it was a wash for the duals, and it was a wash within the first year. And so I think there's an excessive concern sometimes that I see about that, and I wanted to put a little perspective on it. And I have one more final comment too, which has to do about the hours of service, which is that an hour of service, some personal assistants are highly productive and others are not. And so even though we have to measure hours, and we sort of take that as you're getting more if you have more hours, and this is going to be a hard thing for us to measure statistically, but in focus groups and personal interviews, you will hear a lot. And what we saw in cash and counseling is that many people who hired their own workers paid them more, but they said it was worth it, and they took fewer hours because they got so much more productivity out of that hour.
Thank you.